In the year 1241, the knights of Europe believed themselves to be the finest warriors on earth. Their gleaming armor caught the morning sun as they rode into battle, confident that no force could stand against the might of Christendom's cavalry. They had never heard the name Subutai. Within hours, their broken bodies would litter the fields of Hungary and Poland, their proud banners trampled in the mud, their kingdoms left defenseless before a storm that had swept across half the known world. This was not merely a defeat. This was the systematic dismantling of European military power by a man who had conquered more territory than any general in human history. While Europe squabbled over petty kingdoms and feudal disputes, far to the east, a different kind of warfare was being perfected. A warfare so advanced, so ruthlessly efficient, that it would leave medieval Europe's greatest armies looking like children playing with wooden swords. At the heart of this military revolution stood one man, a blacksmith's son from the steppes of Mongolia, who would become the architect of the largest empire the world had ever seen. His name was Subutai, and he was about to teach Europe a lesson it would never forget. The year was 1175 when Subutai drew his first breath somewhere along the banks of the Onon River, beneath the shadow of Mount Burkhan Khaldun, the same mountain where, according to legend, Genghis Khan himself had been born. But where Genghis was destined for greatness by blood and prophecy, Subutai was nothing more than the son of Ögedei, a simple blacksmith whose hands knew iron better than glory. In the rigid social order of the Mongol tribes, men like Subutai were born to serve, not to command. Yet destiny has a way of finding those who dare to seize it. When Subutai was 17, his path crossed with that of a young warrior named Temujin, who would one day be known as Genghis Khan. What Genghis saw in this unremarkable blacksmith's son, history does not record. Perhaps it was the fire in his eyes, or the way he carried himself with quiet confidence despite his humble origins. Whatever it was, Genghis Khan made a decision that would reshape the world. He took Subutai into his service, setting in motion a chain of events that would bring terror to the gates of Vienna and leave Europe's mightiest kingdoms in ruins. But Subutai was no ordinary recruit. While other young warriors dreamed of personal glory and individual combat, he studied the art of war itself. He watched how armies moved, how they communicated, how they could be broken not through brute force alone, but through superior strategy and relentless execution. The Mongol way of war was unlike anything Europe had ever encountered, where European knights valued personal valor above all else. Charging headlong into battle with banners flying, the Mongols fought like a pack of wolves, coordinated, disciplined, and utterly merciless. Subutai's first taste of independent command came in 1197, when he was just 22 years old. The enemy was the Merkit tribe, formidable warriors who had dared to challenge Genghis Khan's growing power. When offered additional troops for the mission, Subutai did something that shocked even his own commanders. He refused. Instead, he rode alone into the Merkit camp, posing as a deserter from Genghis Khan's army. With nothing but his wits and his courage, he convinced the Merkits that the main Mongol force was days away, scattered and weak. It was a masterpiece of deception. When the Mongols struck, the Merkits were caught completely off guard, their forces scattered and unprepared. In a single brilliant stroke, Subutai had demonstrated the principles that would define his career. Intelligence, deception, and the element of surprise were worth more than 1,000 warriors. The young blacksmith's son had announced his arrival on the stage of history, and the world would never be the same. As the Mongol Empire expanded under Genghis Khan's leadership, Subutai rose through the ranks with meteoric speed. But this was no mere case of favoritism or political maneuvering. Subutai earned his position through results that spoke louder than any royal bloodline. While other generals relied on tradition and the same tactics their fathers had used, Subutai revolutionized warfare itself. He was among the first to understand the true value of engineers and siege weapons, incorporating Chinese military technology into Mongol strategy with devastating effect. He developed systems of command and control that would not be matched in Europe for centuries. His armies moved along multiple axes of advance, sometimes separated by thousands of kilometers, yet coordinated with precision that left enemies bewildered and helpless. Unlike European commanders who led from the front, seeking personal glory in the thick of battle, Subutai positioned himself where he could see the entire battlefield, directing the flow of combat with flags and signals like a conductor, commanding an orchestra of destruction. This was not cowardice, this was tactical genius. While European knights charged blindly into whatever lay before them, Subutai's forces moved with purpose and coordination that turned every engagement into a carefully orchestrated massacre. The intelligence networks he created were unmatched in their scope and effectiveness. Spies and scouts ranged far ahead of his armies, gathering detailed information about enemy movements, terrain, and weaknesses. When Subutai struck, it was never random. It was always precisely where his enemies least expected and were least prepared to resist. The Mongols fought not with passion, but with cold, calculating efficiency that made them nearly invincible. But perhaps most revolutionary of all was Subutai's understanding of psychological warfare. He knew that armies could be defeated not just through superior tactics, but by destroying their will to fight. Tales of Mongol brutality spread faster than the armies themselves, sowing terror in the hearts of those who dared to resist. Cities that surrendered were spared. Those that fought were obliterated so completely that their destruction served as a warning to others. It was a strategy that made conquest easier with each victory, as fewer and fewer enemies were willing to test Mongol resolve. In 1221, as Genghis Khan's armies ravaged the Khwarezmian Empire, the great Khan summoned his most trusted general for a special mission. The main campaign would continue in Central Asia, but Subutai would take 20,000 cavalry and push westward on what was officially termed a reconnaissance mission. It was the beginning of a journey that would carry Mongol banners to the very heart of Europe and establish Subutai as the greatest conqueror in human history. The force that rode west with Subutai was unlike anything Europe had ever faced. These were not the heavy cavalry that dominated European battlefields, weighed down by armor and tradition. These were mounted archers, fast as the wind and deadly as winter, capable of covering vast distances while living off the land. Each warrior carried multiple bows, hundreds of arrows, and the skills to use them with lethal precision from the back of a galloping horse. They moved like a storm across the landscape, striking without warning and vanishing before organized resistance could form. Traditional European military thinking simply had no answer for enemies who refused to stand and fight in the accepted manner. The Mongols would appear as if from nowhere, rain death from a distance, and disappear again before anyone could catch them. It was warfare evolved beyond anything medieval Europe could comprehend. As Subutai's reconnaissance force pushed through the Caucasus Mountains, they encountered their first taste of the kingdoms that lay beyond. The Georgians under King George the Brilliant were formidable warriors, proud of their military traditions and confident in their ability to defend their homeland. They were about to receive a harsh education in the realities of modern warfare. The battle that followed would become a masterclass in tactical deception. When the Georgian army took the field, they expected to face an enemy that would meet them sword to sword, shield to shield, in the honorable tradition of medieval combat. Instead, they found themselves fighting ghosts. The Mongol cavalry would charge forward with terrifying speed, loose volleys of arrows that darkened the sky, then wheel away before the Georgian knights could close the distance. Again and again, the pattern repeated. The Georgians would form their battle lines, advance with banners flying, only to find empty ground where their enemies had been moments before. Arrows would whistle from the flanks, cutting down horses and riders alike. But when they turned to face this new threat, the Mongols were already gone. It was like trying to fight the wind itself. Then came the moment that would define Subutai's reputation for generations. As the Georgian army grew frustrated and disorganized, the Mongols suddenly retreated. Not a tactical withdrawal, but a full retreat that carried them back through the mountain passes. King George the Brilliant declared victory. His court celebrated, and Georgia settled into the comfortable belief that they had driven off the barbarian horde. But Subutai had not been defeated. He had been teaching. The retreat was calculated, designed to lull the Georgians into exactly the kind of false confidence that would make his next move devastating. While Georgia celebrated and let down its guard, Subutai was regrouping, resupplying, and planning something that would shatter every assumption about seasonal warfare. Winter was coming, and with it, the season when civilized armies retired to their strongholds to wait for spring. No commander in his right mind would launch a campaign in the depths of winter, when snow choked the mountain passes and cold could kill as surely as any sword. It was a law of warfare as old as war itself. Subutai was about to break that law. When the Mongol army returned, it came like a winter storm given form. The Georgians, caught completely unprepared, scrambled to organize their defenses. But winter had been Subutai's ally, not his enemy. His troops, hardened by life on the steppes, moved through snow and ice as if it were summer grassland. The Georgian army, softened by months of comfortable winter quarters, found themselves fighting for their lives in conditions that sapped their strength and will. The battle was over before it truly began. King George the Brilliant, the man who had claimed victory over the Mongols just months before, fell with his army around him. Georgia, proud and defiant, was crushed so completely that resistance crumbled across the entire kingdom. Subutai had demonstrated one of his cardinal principles: never fight the enemy when and where they expect you to fight. Always strike when they believe themselves safe. But the conquest of Georgia was merely the opening move in a game that stretched far beyond the Caucasus Mountains. As his army moved north toward the grasslands of the Pontic steppe, Subutai encountered the Cumans, a confederation of nomadic tribes who controlled the vast plains between the Black Sea and the Volga River. Here was a different kind of challenge. The Cumans were horsemen like the Mongols, masters of mounted warfare, who could not be easily dismissed as settled farmers playing at war. Yet even here, Subutai's genius for strategy proved decisive. Rather than meeting the Cumans in the kind of cavalry battle they expected, he chose to divide his enemy's bribes. He convinced the Muslim Cumans to abandon. Through careful diplomacy and well-placed broken, he could deal with each group their Christian Georgian allies. With the coalition, the Cumans who had betrayed separately, turning potential allies into enemies and enemies into victims with Subutai, came with hidden the Georgians, learned too late that deals clauses written in blood. Once he had used them to isolate the Georgians, he turned on his temporary allies with the same ruthless efficiency he had shown their former partners. It was a lesson that would echo across the steppes. There was no safety and accommodation with the Mongols. There was only conquest or destruction. As Subutai's army continued its westward advance, something extraordinary happened. Near the shores of the Black Sea, his scouts encountered a group of Venetian merchants, traders from the wealthy Italian Republic, who had traveled far from home in search of profit. What followed was a meeting that would have consequences far beyond anything the merchants could have imagined. The Venetians, practical men who understood that survival often depended on flexibility, struck a deal with the Mongol general. In exchange for safe passage and protection for their trade routes, they would provide Subutai with something more valuable than gold: intelligence. Detailed information about the kingdoms of Western Europe, their armies, their fortifications, their weaknesses. It was information that Subutai filed away carefully, understanding that knowledge was the foundation of all successful conquest. The names of distant kings, the locations of strategic cities, the nature of European military organization, all of it went into the vast mental archive that would one day guide Mongol armies to the gates of Vienna and beyond. But first, there was one more demonstration to be made, one more lesson to be taught to those who still believed that the Mongols were merely another barbarian tribe that could be contained or defeated through traditional means. The lesson would be delivered to Prince Mstislav of Kiev, ruler of one of the most powerful principalities in all of Rus. When word reached Kiev that a Mongol army was approaching, Prince Mstislav assembled a force that represented the flower of Eastern European chivalry. 80,000 warriors answered his call, a host that dwarfed Subutai's reconnaissance force by nearly 4-to-1. Armored cavalry, disciplined infantry, experienced commanders who had fought in dozens of campaigns. It was an army that should have been more than capable of crushing a mere scouting expedition. The battle that followed became known as the Battle of Kalka River, and it would stand as one of the most complete military disasters in European history, not because the European army lacked courage or skill, but because they were fighting an enemy that had evolved beyond their understanding. The Mongols did not meet them in honorable combat. They did not charge shield wall against shield wall in the manner that European warfare demanded. Instead, they fought like wolves, harrying the flanks, striking from unexpected angles, using the terrain itself as a weapon. The massive European army found itself scattered and confused, unable to bring its superior numbers to bear against an enemy that refused to stand still long enough to be properly fought. Formations broke apart as units tried to pursue fleeting Mongol forces, only to find themselves isolated and surrounded. When the slaughter finally ended, Prince Mstislav lay dead with most of his army around him. 80,000 warriors had been reduced to scattered remnants in a single day. The victory was so complete, so overwhelming, that it seemed almost impossible to comprehend. Yet it was merely a preview of what was to come. As news of the catastrophe spread across the principalities of Rus, Subutai gathered his forces and began the long journey back to Mongolia. But this was no retreat. This was the return of a general who had just completed the most successful reconnaissance mission in military history. He had mapped the armies of Europe, tested their tactics, measured their will to fight, and found them all wanting. The intelligence he brought back to Genghis Khan was worth more than any treasure. Europe lay open, its defenses understood, its weaknesses catalogued. Yet fate would delay the inevitable reckoning. Genghis Khan died in 1227, and the succession crisis that followed consumed the Mongol Empire's attention for more than a decade. Subutai, now in his 50s, watched as the great Khan's sons and grandsons squabbled over their inheritance. But he never forgot what he had learned during those years in the West. The memory of European battlefields burned in his mind, like a map of future conquest. When Ögedei Khan finally consolidated power and turned his attention westward, Subutai was ready. The reconnaissance mission of 1221 had been merely the prologue. Now would come the main event, a campaign of conquest that would bring Mongol rule to the very heart of Europe. The year was 1237, and Subutai, despite being over 60 years old, was about to embark on the greatest military campaign of his legendary career. The force that assembled for the invasion of Europe was unlike anything the continent had ever faced. This was not a barbarian horde driven by bloodlust and greed. This was a military machine engineered for conquest, commanded by generals who had spent decades perfecting the art of war. Nominally led by Batu Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan, the true architect of the campaign was Subutai himself, now bearing the accumulated wisdom of 40 years of warfare. The plan was breathtaking in its scope and precision. 3 massive armies would advance along separate routes, each with specific objectives that served the greater strategy. The northern force would sweep through Poland, crushing any armies that might come to Hungary's aid. The southern force would advance through the Carpathian passes, seizing control of the mountain routes. The Central Army, commanded by Subutai himself, would strike at the heart of Hungarian power. It was the kind of coordinated, multi-front campaign that European military thinking could barely comprehend. Medieval armies moved slowly, fought seasonally, and rarely coordinated beyond the most basic level. The Mongols were about to demonstrate what modern warfare looked like, executed with a precision that would not be matched in Europe for centuries. The assault on the Rus principalities began with methodical efficiency. City after city fell to Mongol siege engines, their walls crumbling under bombardments delivered by Chinese engineers who had perfected their craft during decades of warfare in the east. Ryazan, Moscow, Vladimir. Each fortress that had seemed impregnable to European eyes proved helpless against weapons and tactics that belonged to a different age of warfare. But it was not just the technology that set the Mongols apart. It was their understanding of war as a science rather than an art. While European armies relied on individual heroism and traditional tactics passed down through generations, the Mongols fought with cold, calculating precision. Every movement served a purpose. Every battle advanced the greater strategy. Subutai's forces moved through the frozen landscape like a plague of steel and fire. The winter that should have protected the Russian cities instead became their executioner. European armies traditionally went into winter quarters, waiting for spring before resuming their campaigns. The Mongols used winter as a weapon, striking when their enemies believed themselves safe behind walls and weather. The Siege of Kiev in 1240 became a masterpiece of military engineering. The city that had stood as the crown jewel of Eastern Europe for centuries found itself surrounded by forces that seemed to appear from nowhere. The Mongol siege train included weapons that the defenders had never seen before. Catapults that could hurl stones the size of mill wheels, siege towers that rose higher than the city walls, and most terrifying of all, Chinese fire weapons that turned sections of the city into infernos. When Kiev finally fell, the destruction was so complete that it served as a warning to every kingdom in Europe. This was not conquest in the traditional sense, where armies fought armies and the winner took the spoils. This was the systematic dismantling of civilization itself, carried out with an efficiency that left observers stunned and terrified. As reports filtered westward of cities burned and armies annihilated, the kingdoms of Europe began to grasp the magnitude of the threat bearing down upon them. This was not another border conflict or dynastic dispute that could be resolved through negotiation or limited warfare. This was an existential crisis that demanded every resource, every alliance, every desperate measure that Christian Europe could muster. Yet even as the threat became clear, the response remained fragmented and inadequate. The Holy Roman Empire was paralyzed by its ongoing conflict with the Pope. France was consumed by its own internal struggles. England was separated by the Channel and focused on its continental possessions. The very political divisions that had defined medieval Europe now became fatal weaknesses that the Mongols would exploit with surgical precision. In Poland, Duke Henry II the Pious attempted to organize a defense that would at least slow the Mongol advance. He gathered forces from across his duchy, calling upon the flower of Polish knighthood to stand against the eastern threat. The Teutonic Knights answered his summons, as did contingents of Knights Templar and Knights Hospitaller from France. It was a force that represented everything Europe believed about warfare, honor, and the invincibility of armored cavalry. They would meet the Mongols at a place called Legnica, and there they would learn that all their assumptions about warfare were dangerously, fatally wrong. The date was April 9th, 1241, and it would become one of the darkest days in the history of European chivalry. Duke Henry's army numbered perhaps 30,000 men, a force that should have been more than capable of handling what intelligence reports described as a mere raiding party. The Polish knights rode to battle confident in their superiority, their armor gleaming in the spring sunshine, their banners snapping in the wind. They had never faced an enemy like the Mongols, and their ignorance would cost them everything. The battle began at dawn with the thunder of hooves as Polish cavalry charged across the field toward what appeared to be a relatively small force of Mongol horsemen. It was exactly what Subutai's subordinates had planned. The Mongols gave ground, appearing to retreat in disorder before the magnificent charge of European knighthood. The Polish knights pressed their advantage, pursuing what they believed to be a broken enemy. It was the oldest trick in the Mongol tactical manual, and it worked with devastating effectiveness. As the Polish knights stretched out their formation in pursuit, they found themselves separated from their supporting infantry and increasingly isolated on a battlefield that was not what it appeared to be. The retreating Mongols suddenly wheeled and struck, but not from the front, from the flanks, from the rear, from positions that the pursuing knights had never seen them occupy. What followed was not a battle but a slaughter. The flower of Polish knighthood found themselves trapped in a killing ground that had been prepared with meticulous care. Mongol archers poured volleys of arrows into the confused mass of knights, while cavalry units struck from multiple directions simultaneously. The heavy European cavalry, so dominant on battlefields across the continent, proved helpless against enemies who refused to meet them in conventional combat. Duke Henry II the Pious died with most of his army around him, his head severed and paraded on a Mongol spear before the walls of Legnica. The survivors who managed to escape carried with them tales of horror that spread across Europe faster than the Mongol advance itself. This was not warfare as Europeans understood it. This was something else entirely, something that challenged every assumption about military power and knightly valor. But Legnica was merely a diversion, a sideshow designed to prevent northern European forces from interfering with Subutai's main objective. Even as the Polish army was being destroyed, the real target of the Mongol campaign was preparing for the battle that would decide the fate of Central Europe. In Hungary, King Bela IV was assembling what many considered to be the finest army in all of Christendom, and so the blacksmith's son from the steppes of Mongolia had shattered the military might of an entire continent. From the frozen walls of Kiev to the blood-soaked fields of Hungary, Subutai had demonstrated that European warfare was centuries behind the military science he had perfected. His campaigns crushed armies, toppled kingdoms, and left the greatest knights of Christendom broken in the mud. Only the death of Ögedei Khan saved Europe from complete conquest. Subutai the Invincible had conquered more territory than any general in human history, yet his name remains unknown to most. The greatest military mind the world had ever seen, forgotten by the very continent he had brought to its knees. When Subutai finally withdrew from Europe in 1242, he left behind a continent transformed. The knights who had once believed themselves invincible now understood the terrible reality of their obsolescence. The kingdoms that had squabbled over petty disputes had witnessed what true military power looked like when wielded by a master. From the ruins of Kiev to the blood-soaked fields of Mohi, Europe had received an education in warfare that it would never forget. Yet perhaps the greatest tragedy of Subutai's story is not the destruction he wrought, but how quickly the world forgot the lessons he taught. Within a generation, European armies had returned to their old ways, their old assumptions, their old belief in the supremacy of individual valor over tactical brilliance. The man who had conquered more territory than Alexander the Great, Caesar, and Napoleon combined became little more than a footnote in histories written by those who had never understood what they were truly facing. Subutai died in 1248, an old man who had served 4 great Khans and never lost a battle. He had crushed 32 nations, won 65 pitched battles, and conquered territories from China to Hungary. Yet his greatest victory may have been proving that genius can emerge from anywhere, that the son of a blacksmith can reshape the world if he possesses the vision to see beyond the limitations others accept as eternal truths. The next time you hear someone claim that the past was simpler, that medieval warfare was crude and primitive, remember Subutai the Invincible. Remember the man who taught Europe that the future of warfare belonged not to those who fought hardest, but to those who thought clearest.